So I'm Detective Hinkle with the State Police Major Crime Section out of Salem.
My name is John Harrington. I'm the captain of our Criminal Investigation Division out of our general headquarters, under which is our Major Crime Section. And Detective Hinkle is one of our Salem Major Crimes Section members.
So I've been with the State Police for about 12 years, and I've been a detective for about 7. So this is Janie Landers' story. So on March 9th, 1979, Janie walked away from Fairview. She was a patient there and had been for most of her life. On March 14th, 1979, her body was discovered on a remote field off of Highway 214 near milepost 23.1. It is almost to the park, to Silver Creek Falls, if you're coming from Lake Staten.
Can we get you closer to the mic?
Oh, sure. From 1979 to 2001, the State Police reopened this case several times. When we did, it was to follow up on a specific lead. So we'd get information about a lead, it'd get opened, they'd investigate that lead, and then it'd be closed again once that was exhausted. There's a couple of other times where we reopened it for serial killers that were operating in the area to examine whether or not Janie met their victimology, but those were all defunct and closed. In 2001, retired Detective Ken Pacina was assigned the case and kind of brought the evidence up to that current standard at that point. And he spent a great deal of time. He identified that there were 4 hairs that were missing at the time that were in Janie's hand at autopsy. He spent the rest of his time trying to figure out what happened to those. Never was able to find out what happened to those hairs. Go to the next one. So from the historical case, once we got it, we started poring over all the old police reports and case files. In the case files at the time, all the old pictures were in there. There was undeveloped film in there, all the old original recordings and stuff. So we had to bring that up to today's standards and preserve it the best we could from the beginning. So one of the most tedious tasks that we had was taking all the old pictures and taking digital images of those pictures to preserve them, and then submitting film to get developed again, and converting old tape recorded statements into digital format. So we spent a great deal of time doing things like that.
That's a challenge in a lot of these cold cases that we work is, you know, a lot of times in this case 37, 38 years had gone by the time that Detective Hinkle opened it up, and putting the case binders back together and you know, kind of bringing it up to modern standards for presentation to the DA's office, and you know, tracking some reports down. That always happens in these old cases.
So from the historical case file, we identified a couple of people as persons of interest based on the articulated information in those reports. One of them was Mr. Graf. Mr. Graf was Janie's one-to-one counselor when she lived in the group homes, and she was being assimilated back onto Fairview main campus at that time. So Mr. Graf was helping her with that assimilation. We found out that his funding for his position was cut at that particular time, really close proximity to Janie's murder and disappearance from Fairview, and so that was a little bit suspect. He was also seen talking to her right before she walked off. So he is one of the last couple of people to be seen talking to her at the time she was missing. He was polygraphed back in 1979 and passed that polygraph, but we were willing to look at him again. Now, I will say that eventually we found out that Mr. Graf did have nothing to do with this and became a very good witness in this case also. So I did track him down and interview him later, and he proved to be helpful. Mr. Raymond Wright here was another one that we identified as a person of interest because he had motive and access based on the old case file. His girlfriend was Cheryl, who lived in the group home with Janie. They were in an altercation, and Janie threw hot chili off the stove in her face and put her in the burn unit. So he was not a fan of hers, and therefore, you know, he had some animosity towards her, so we looked at that being a motive for him. Detective Glover, who's retired now, followed that lead from about 89 to 95. He tracked him down and interviewed him. Nothing of note came from that. I mean, he of course denied any involvement. There really wasn't anything that we could do to confirm or deny any of the facts that came out of that. And I learned once I started looking at it that Mr. Wright was deceased in 1998. So the next thing we looked at was, as we said, going through all the old stuff and bringing it back up to current standards, and then going through the autopsy report. So we wanted to get the documentation for her injuries and photographs to look at. So once we looked through those, we were able to determine that this was a very dynamic fight. Janie fought very hard, probably unexpectedly due to her very small stature, but she was a fighter. She had a lot of defensive wounds on her, and there was more than one method used to kill her, which indicated to us that there was it was very unorganized. Whoever killed her, this was a sporadic event. It wasn't pre-planned. We stabbed her multiple times with a great deal of force, and eventually her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Let me go to the next one. So this is a depiction of the stab wounds. What we can see, I mean, we intentionally removed the human piece of this just to show the wounds themselves, but as you can tell, we took particular note that these are very, very deep stab wounds. They're around the neck area on the back, but they're on both sides. So this is pretty dynamic. It's also on the lower extremities, on the arms. So there's no hilt abrasion on the stab wounds. That was something we took particular note of. So
the significance of a lack of a hilt abrasion, we see this in many cases where there's a homicide, either an active one or a cold case with multiple stabbings. You know, the knife gets slippery because there's blood on it, right? And so in some of these cases, we see that the suspect's hand slips down onto the blade of the knife, causing injury to themselves. Hilt abrasion being the bruise around the point where the knife enters the body. The absence of that was telling. So we thought at that point there could be some of the suspect's blood evidence on the victim.
I would say probably that fact, along with the fact that she fought very hard. So our thought process was that they got cut by the knife, but if they didn't, she probably scratched them at a minimum. So stomach contents also indicated that she died the day she went missing, because her stomach contents were consistent with the noon meal served at Fairview that day. So we were able to fairly easily make that determination. Crime scene was, this is a secondary scene or a body dump site. Very evident because there's no disturbance around the body, there's no blood evidence, there's no evidence of a fight, which we know had to have occurred based on all her injuries. So this is very clearly just a dump site. There's almost nothing of evidentiary value found here other than the body itself and then some tire tracks that they identified, and did a pretty good job of preserving there, hopefully, for future identification.
We presume that if this stabbing and brutal death would have occurred, there would have been quite a bit of blood evidence left at the scene, and then there was virtually none. So that really gave us an indication that this homicide had occurred elsewhere.
So in the original case file, there was 4 witnesses that saw Janie talking to a man at the entrance to Fairview on Strong Road going towards Madrona. And those 4 witnesses worked with a sketch artist from Statesman Journal and came up with this sketch. They saw the man talking to her and identified a vehicle associated as a 4-door late model domestic sedan. And it was supposed to be blue, or gold or yellowish in color. That was the best we had. So we had tons of case file stuff about cars that all matched that vague description. 2 of them worked at the snack bar and described this guy as ordering something that day. They remembered him because of the clothing he was wearing, and they said, yeah, I remember him, I remember what he was ordering. So it's fairly significant. So on June 25th, 2015, then Lieutenant Harrington and I went down to the Springfield lab, and we talked with Jennifer Riddell, who is the trace evidence scientists that process the evidence, and we kind of came up with a game plan. We wanted to discuss what our theories were about the actual violent attack on Janie itself, and where we thought our best likelihood to get evidence was. So we went over kind of the clothing and came up with a plan of attack for submitting all the evidence and where to start looking.
The problem with some of these cold cases is that when there's a lot of blood and a lot of trauma, there's an abundance of blood evidence and of the victims in comparison to a very minute amount of blood evidence of the suspect. And so a lot of times this is like finding a needle in a haystack. When we send it to our lab, they do a really thorough job screening, and they can test spots that may belong to our suspect or our victim. And obviously, as the result shows, in this case, we got lucky. So.
So on July 6, 2015, all the evidence was that we had came up with was submitted to the lab for DNA testing. So on April 5th, 2016 now, forensic scientist Jen Riddell contacted me and told me that we had a hit. So they identified a male DNA profile from a blood stain on her clothing. So this is a picture that went out in the press release yesterday. That's of her Janie sweater that she was wearing at the time, and there's a blood stain on that belonged to an unknown male. The next day, on April 6th, Ms. Riddell called me again and said that Kyle Mitchell from the Portland lab DNA scientist found a CODIS hit on our guy, on our DNA profile, and it was Mr. Gerald Kenneth Dunlap. So we didn't know who he was, but his blood's on her, so we had to figure out how he played into this thing.
So that everyone knows that CODIS, that he refers to as our combined DNA index system, it's maintained by the FBI. His DNA profile was entered into that.
So the next task was figuring out how Gerald Dunlap played into this whole thing and if he could have been the one that killed her. So what we found out was that Mr. Dunlap had died in prison. He was at Snake River Correctional and died in January 7, 2002. He'd been sentenced on a first-degree sex abuse from Marion County in 1996. That was the charge that put him there. And he had also been convicted of a rape in Tennessee, in Knoxville, in 1961. And what happened in that was that he had robbed a laundromat, and in the course of the robbery had raped the clerk behind the counter at gunpoint. And the interesting thing there is that he was tried for a death penalty at that time and sentenced to life. The criminal history said 99 years. His sentence was life at that point and was paroled in 1973. We then found out that after 73, he was paroled and moved to California. He was registered as a sex offender in LA and then moved up to Oregon in 1974. So then we had to figure out how in the heck we were going to prove this guy had any kind of access at all to Janie or who he was. We found out that he was employed at Fairview as a laundry worker. We actually did find records, amazingly enough, that proved he was a worker in laundry at that particular time and had access to our victim. He worked there from 76 to 83. So let's go to the next one. We found at State Archives some documentation of Janie. There really was. We were looking for employment records, but there really isn't anything there. So we found some log entries, some worded log entries pertaining to Janie that we just took pictures of and documented. The one showing that she went AWOL from the facility, and a couple others from close proximity to the time. So then the next thing we were trying to do is get a picture of this guy, because the only picture I got of him is an old man in Oregon Department of Corrections. That's not what he looked like at the time. So we kind of struck out and everywhere we went on that. There's Oregon DMV doesn't have any pictures of people prior to 1990, neither does California. They don't have any vehicle records prior to 1990, and we really didn't. We were striking out on ways to get a hold of a picture of this guy. So we contacted the Tennessee Department of Corrections and kind of got a little bit of a Hail Mary there when they said they had a booking photo of this guy right before he got paroled in 1973. So he was paroled January of 73. This picture is of him in November of 72. So this is pretty close. But the first thing that we noticed was that he looks a lot like our sketch. So especially particularly the profile picture, but his nose, his eyes, his hairline, his chin, and the slope of his head, especially at the back there, all match pretty strikingly. So the next things that we did was we were trying to prove or disprove whether or not there could have been a logical reason for him bleeding on her clothing, right? He's a laundry worker, so we wanted to make sure that there's not another explanation for this. So we submitted tons of DNA evidence to be tested, whatever else we could find, and kind of hit no further leads because it's all pretty degraded by now. So we started tracking down witnesses, and we found that 2 of the 4 original witnesses that saw the guy from the sketch are still alive, so we contacted them. And we administered a photo lineup to those 2 witnesses, and they picked out Mr. Dunlap from that lineup. Now, I'll say that after 38 years and change, they did not make 100% identification. But what they did do was they were able to articulate specific features that said, yeah, this looks like the guy. I can't be 100% certain, and both of them independently said that it was just because it had been so long. So to me, that lent a lot of credibility to their statement, that they weren't just being helpful to be helpful, but they actually did believe this is the guy that they saw.
It's remarkable, really. A lot of times a day later we'll show a photo lineup to a victim and we won't get 100%. This is our guy. In this case, we got about as good as we get, sometimes contemporaneous with the actual crime. So the identification we really felt was pretty good by these two eyewitnesses.
So now that we were able to talk to people from Fairview that worked there, we started getting leads on other folks that worked in laundry. So we tracked down some coworkers and supervisors that worked in laundry at the time that Mr. Dunlap worked there. And we interviewed them and got some pretty good insight into him. Some of the coworkers said that, you know, they couldn't trust him and didn't care for him much. There's a comment that that he was creepy and kind of creeped out the women that worked there. The family said that they used to hike at Silver Creek Falls, so we did eventually contact his stepson and wife, who are still alive, and they said they used to go camping up in Detroit, but they'd hike at Silver Creek Falls quite a bit, and they were familiar with the area. And they both described the car that he had at the time as being a late model domestic car with that same color, yellow or goldish in color. So it matched that description as well. Let's go to the next. So kind of in conclusion, the blood stain on the sweater was confirmed that it's Mr. Dunlap's DNA. What we also found out from the laundry workers was that his job in laundry was to take in the soiled clothing as it came in off the trucks, and then it would immediately go to be laundered from there. It's not like he folded clothes after it was finished. So the likelihood of him bleeding on their clothes inadvertently through a function of his job, and that being how that stain came there is not likely at all, because it would have immediately been laundered. So that we sort of feel that we've sufficiently refuted that potential argument. His previous sexual convictions obviously speak to motive, but they, clearly depict that he had a preference to assault young females. He worked in laundry, obviously, and we proved that through payroll records, supervisor statements, and coworkers. He has obviously a very striking resemblance to the composite sketches done. And another comment that was made is that Mr. Dunlap used to go to the bus stops where the patients would wait to get taken to appointments and try to get them to get in his car so he could give them a ride. We felt that was pretty significant. He was also familiar with the body dump site, according to the family, so that we felt that was another kind of important fact to throw in there. So kind of in summary, the evidence I think pretty clearly points and supports that on March 9th, 1979, Gerald Kenneth Dunlap murdered Janie Landers and subsequently dumped her body on Highway 214 near milepost 23.1. Mr. Dunlap died as a result of a heart condition at Oregon Department of Corrections, Snake River Correctional Institution, 2002.
Here's his obituary.
That's, I think from the Statesman Journal, that's his obituary from January 2002.
Any questions?
Yes. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Was it common for people that weren't employed at Fairview facility to use the cafeteria there?
So the facility, I guess to answer your question, I don't know entirely. But I will say that based on reading the investigation from the time, there was people openly going and applying for jobs all the time there. It wasn't locked down. Any public could go up and apply for a job at that time, and that was one of the things that they focused on for leads in the original investigation. They were looking at anybody that applied for a job at that time and had any kind of a sexual conviction, and at the time we didn't have criminal histories like we have now to kind of cross-reference, so that was sort of spotty, but they were doing their best to kind of focus in on that type of a population.
But here, no, sorry, I just want to follow up on it. So here's a guy that was literally under the noses of the original investigators.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a history, of his coworkers of being like a creep.
Yeah.
So,
We didn't have
was the initial investigation less than thorough?
we didn't have the data and data sharing capability that back then that we have now, specifically between the states.
No, but still, just what was going on there in Fairview. Here, he was someone that bought food at the cafeteria that day, was an employee of that place, had a rep going, with his coworkers. He was not like interviewed. Is that sort of like, kind of lax investigating by the original investigating officers?
I wouldn't want to speculate on that. We don't know what happened back then and why he escaped their radar. We really don't. So, we could all play, Monday morning quarterback on those guys back then, and think of what we might have done, but it's hard to speculate. But I do see your point.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
How does it feel?
I'm glad that we were able to bring the family some closure on this. They waited an awful long time to finally figure out what happened to Janie and get some closure and figure out who did it. So I was glad that we were able to bring that to her.
The recipe that I've seen for a lot of these solving of old cases, there seems to be a similar recipe in a lot of these, and it starts with a vocal and persistent family advocate. Someone that calls up and says, "Hey, would you take a look at this?" Because my guys, my major crimes detectives, they've all got 30, 40 cases on their plate, active cases at any given time, right? So to take a step back and look at something this complex and this difficult to put together really takes a monumental effort. So vocal, persistent family member, number one. Number two, a dogged detective. Detective Hinkle is extremely hardworking and extremely intelligent. He put a lot of his own time into this case. He really took it under his wing and brought it to where it was. Other factors like our forensic services division, we made some incredible advances in forensic science. Not just in DNA analysis. We wouldn't have been able to probably analyze this evidence back then based on the evolution of DNA analysis. But other things, just screening of evidence, that's improved too. And then luck. There was definitely some luck involved here too. We were glad that the evidence was not degraded to the point where we couldn't get a good profile, and we did get that. So.
Where was the evidence stored all this time?
It was in the evidence locker when I got it, in our evidence locker.
Salem PD?
No, Salem, at the state police office.
State police.
So it was there. That was one of the first things I did was Detective Barrientos and I went down and audited the evidence. We wanted to physically see what it was and in what condition it was in and how it was packaged so that we'd kind of get an idea of how we could likely be able to submit stuff. So that was one of the first things we did.
It had not been submitted for DNA before?
No, it had not. Well, in 2001, they didn't have the capability. DNA in Oregon was pretty new. So you can speak more to that.
So the modern DNA analysis continually advances, right? So I can't even say 3 years ago that the technology is what it is today because we're making continual advances, right? In 1999 is when our state police crime lab started PCR, STR, which is a newer version of DNA testing. And so it was just started at that time, and the last time this case was looked at was 2001. So, we kind of had a couple years there where maybe it could have been submitted when it was last open, but the reality is in 2001, like some of these do, it sat for several years. And
then the needle in the haystack part, was that because there was blood on different parts of the sweater and you guys had to kind of say what would be the most likely where he would have had contact?
Exactly.
Yeah, so you saw the stab wound injuries to the neck area, so clearly it's a tank top type shirt. There's the highest volume of blood for her is up here, right? So we were focusing on what would be the lower parts of that, the pants, the shoes. We wanted to focus on lower extremities where there'd be gravity bleeding that could be more likely from the killer in addition, or maybe a mixture from the killer and the
so then what was that like when you guys got the notification from the lab, hey, we got something?
I was surprised. And then who the heck is this guy?
I think our scientists were more excited than we were. We were excited, but our scientists really, they did a great job here. And finding something like that in such an old case, with such an innocent victim is just remarkable.
Detective, you put a lot of work into this. Were you quite disappointed that after pinpointing the most likely perpetrator of this heinous murder, that he wasn't alive to face justice?
I think so, and more so for the family. I mean, I think they would have liked to have seen him be held accountable for that in trial. Unfortunately, we're never going to be able to do that, so there's a little bit disappointing, but at least we were able to identify who it was and get, present it to the district attorney's office for an official determination, and could at least present the family with that.
Do you like him for anything else?
Not that I know of. We don't have any information that supports anything else at this point.
Was he arrested? Can you speak to why he was in Snake River?
Yeah, so he was convicted of first-degree sex abuse in 1996 in Marion County.
Of a family member.
And I think I saw, at least in the DA's release, some props to that victim who came forward. Otherwise, you'd never have the DNA.
Absolutely. If it was not for that victim, we would have never found him, because that's how his DNA got into CODIS. That conviction was absolutely the reason why that happened.
And very early on, you mentioned 4 hairs. I think like 4 strands of hair.
4 strands of hair were in her hand, and those are gone. We'll never be able to find those again.
So when you're looking into it, you're like, oh, nuts.
Yeah, and that was kind of the tangent that we went down in 2001, was trying to figure out what happened to those. And then we, Captain Harrington and I went and tried to figure that out again, and we just kind of came to a dead end. What happened was our crime lab in Salem and Portland moved several times. The Salem office moved several times, and the Portland office moved several times in there. And in the 70s and 80s, we didn't keep track of things like we do now. So it's hard to say. I guess there's really no way to determine how that happened at this point.
And then finally, are there unsolved cases now with bags of evidence that are just waiting for the future for technology to catch up?
There are. We have some. We track them in our criminal investigation division, and get to them and work them as we can, and as we review them for their solvability, potential. Really, is all I can say, and based on the resources we have.
Detective, how many other cases are you working on, or are you going to work on now?
I think our whole section carries a caseload roughly around 30 active cases at a time. I'm probably somewhere in there without looking right now, but.
Just, I think the question also was, how many are there? And that's difficult to pin down. If you're talking about homicides in which the Oregon State Police was a lead investigative agency, because we help out with local police departments, smaller underserved counties, and their investigations. But if we've adopted a lead, we have a list that includes dozens. Okay, the problem with the majority of these cases is that they were thoroughly worked throughout the years. The majority of them have been reanalyzed as we've gotten information in or advances in DNA. So if the question is how many are kind of ripe for the picking, and I would say not a lot. There's probably some out there, but that's assessment that we perform, from time to time as we tamp down the active homicides that we're working and get that under control, and then we kind of go back to these that are sitting.
Did they request that? They requested you take the case, right?
Yeah, so Joyce is Janie's younger sister. She had been in contact with the state police over the years, and it was around, when I got assigned the case, it was around the time of the anniversary of Janie's murder. So she had again contacted and just asked that it be reopened. There was no new information at that point at all. So
who had it before?
2001, Detective Pacina had it.
In OSP?
Yeah.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
You guys already had it.
It had been, it never left. It was just there.
To take it beyond work, what drove you in this particular case? If it's dogged determination, but
Just wanting it to be solved for the family. I mean, it needed to be solved. It's a vulnerable young girl that got murdered for no reason, and somebody did it. Somebody needed to be held accountable.
So will you pick up another cold case or not?
If I get assigned one, I
Oh,
will.
it's, you don't have a choice, they just kind of say, here you go.
Well, he's got a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, but I would, yeah, absolutely. I would. I don't have one right now.
Is this your first one?
This is the first cold case I worked, yeah. I worked other homicides, but not a cold one.
Was there a point early on where you're saying, this is a mess, or maybe not a mess, but this is going to be a really hard nut to crack, and so many other smart people have looked at it, this is not going to be easy?
Yeah, I mean, I knew when I got assigned it that it was a very low statistical likelihood that we'd solve it, especially after that amount of time had gone by, but just did it anyway. And that was part of the reason why when we first got this case, we started going through all the old stuff and preserving it, at least to the point it was now, like where we're taking and converting all the images to digital images and stuff like that, because if we weren't able to solve it now, maybe somebody will 10 years from now. And if we don't at least make some efforts to preserve it, it's only going to degrade between now and then. So that was one of the first things we did, was start kind of going through tediously and trying to preserve what we could.
38 years between the crime and resolution.
Mhm.
Do you have any idea how that ranks? You know, is that one of the longest stretches in cold cases between, crime committed and being solved? Seems like it's
I don't know.
I've worked these cases for over 2 decades, and I can tell you this is close to a record, especially for the state police. It is on the longer side. And the problem really is that DNA degrades, and there's a ticking clock on DNA evidence, and there's so many factors that play into the degradation, from the time elapsed to the way it's stored to humidity. I mean, all those things. And you never know. You could have a case that's 15 years old that was stored improperly or packaged improperly, where the DNA is gone, and you could have one of this age where we got lucky and we did some things right back when we packaged it and we stored it, and we got lucky. So.